said. Before we begin, we like to do a land acknowledgement. And so I'm going to just say that I'm currently based in Winnipeg, which is the homeland of the Red River Métis. And Future of Good's home base is a little farther east. They are on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory in what is now Alberta. So we do this because we want to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who are our hosts and our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past while moving forward in partnership in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So with that in mind, Future of Good is dedicated to holding space for Indigenous voices, knowledge, perspectives, and ways of being in our journalism, and has committed to continually improving how we fulfill these intentions. If you're joining us today, you will notice that we have 3 speakers on the bill. They are all here, but again, like I said, technical difficulties are making things a little, how would we say, a little fraught. But I will introduce the speakers and hopefully we can get everything going. So I'd like to start with Mr. Andy Harrington, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Food Bank's the Canadian Food Grains Bank. That's a hard one to say for me apparently this morning. Andy, thank you for being here.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And then we have Philippe, Dongier, the Executive Director of CECI. And we also hopefully will have Dorothy Nyambi, who is the CEO of MEDA. And she will, I know she's trying to join us and dealing with some things as well. So, but in the meantime, I would like to get started. And if you're joining us
Well, this is all going swimmingly, I think. Don't you, Philippe?
Indeed.
We can have a conversation amongst ourselves and hope that other people are listening as well.
That's right. We could do that. We've actually prepared some thoughts on the questions asked. So
excellent. So let's begin. And Andy, I think I will just throw this to you. My sincere apologies. I guess my internet is unstable as well. But we're talking about the consequences of USAID's dismantling. We're going to see consequences, I think you'll agree, around the world and for generations. But can you narrow down for me a little bit, like which regions or sectors will be hardest hit?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Alicia. Thanks for having me here. And sorry about the technical difficulties, but I think we can still carry through. So with the consequences of the USAID cuts are going to be global in many different ways. So the first thing to note, obviously, is that 50%, roughly around 50% of the global aid infrastructure financing is being ripped apart.
I'm going to stop you, Andy. My sincere apologies.
No,
Jahanzeb, our moderator, has just joined us. Jahanzeb, please take over. My apologies for the rough start.
And you were doing so well as well, Alicia. You were doing great. You're a pro.
Anyways, please continue, Andy.
My apologies, everyone, for the technical delays. Andy, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So what I was saying was that we've seen 50% of the global aid financial infrastructure just be taken away and it's ripped apart. That is interestingly awful, and it's specifically awful in a number of ways. The first one would be that much of that money has actually already been spent by the partner agencies that are spending it. So it's paid in arrears. And so even this morning, the Supreme Court finding by one of the judges there has said that those contracts can be annulled. And so we are aware of organizations that are up to $25 million in arrear with USAID. That money is just disappearing. So there is a threat in terms of the organizational ecosystem, the development ecosystem, in terms of that money just disappearing in terms of what's been spent, but also as we go forward. In terms of what that means for individual organizations, there are thousands of organizations. I think I heard this morning it was 5,800 contracts that have been cut, that are suddenly cut off from their funds. Within our own network, we work with partners. We've had partners have to lay off 900 of just over 1,200 staff in places like Ethiopia. We've had 500 of 650 staff laid off in one partner in Kenya. And so we're seeing massive impacts. In terms of the areas, Alicia asked about the areas. Well, some of the worst humanitarian crises in the world are areas where USAID has been very functional. Places like South Sudan, Somalia, the DRC at the moment, Afghanistan. These are areas where we're going to see major implications. And I do really want to bring this back to what it means for people on the ground. This is not a forward-looking issue. This is an emergency issue right now. There are millions of people that have been cut off from critical supplies and infrastructure and resources that they need. Kitchens that are the only source of food in places like South Sudan and Sudan have been closed, that have been funded by over 1,000 kitchens, actually, that are major ways of feeding people in some of those areas have just been closed. People are turning up to clinics. We're hearing stories of people turning up to clinics that have been shuttered. Kids going to schools where the teachers have been fired or laid off because there's no funding for them. So it is a critical issue. And the final thing I want to say, I'm sure Philippe will want to say something as well. We're a global ecosystem. So an organization like ours, for example, Canadian Food Grains Bank, which doesn't have USAID funding, still is part of this ecosystem. And so that whilst our projects run on a separate pipeline of funding, they very much take advantage of all of the support structures that are maintained from the overhead payments of USAID and numerous other places. So we're suddenly seeing the closure of things like some of our PSEA pipelines because that was actually co-funded by a number of other organizations as well. So it's a bit like being part of a body and your arm and your leg and one of your kidneys has been ripped out. The body doesn't function as well. So we have some immediate consequences and some phase 2 consequences that will probably come till later.
Andy, perfect. Thank you for laying that out. Philippe, I want to come to you. We heard what Andy said, and from what I understand, CECI has been directly impacted as well because of the funding cuts. From what I understand, there was a project in Mali worth $3 million, which had to be cut. So perhaps we can use this discussion to bring the discussion back to Canada and perhaps talk directly about the impacts that the Canadian development sector is facing.
Yeah, well, I think there are a range of sectors where the impact is huge, and humanitarian is the one that was supposed to be exempted. And in fact, just to tell you the story of our relatively small project, we're talking a $3 million project in Mali, but which is doing something really extremely sensitive, which is direct food aid, shelter support for populations displaced. It's 123,000 people displaced by the conflict. And we had been actually first informed that we were exempted from the cut. We received a letter saying, okay, well, your project is actually on. We had been on pause initially, so we were happy at least by that news. And then just yesterday, got a second letter saying that it's actually cut because after review is determined that it is not in national interest of the USA. So therefore, the point that, and I learned from someone else that there is a large chunk, in fact, of the humanitarian that has been cut off. And you're talking about clearly humanitarian. This is not something where you could be on the fence. It's development in the name of humanitarian. It's really not. This is life support to populations that are displaced without any means of survival. So it's truly atrocious. And the way it's done, I think we all know that, and it's amazing how it can be done in some way without an appearance of remorse. In terms of Canada, I don't think the Canadian organizations are severely hurt directly. You see, for us, it's about 5% of our budget, or 3% of our budget. So it's not a very large issue, and I don't think that many Canadian organizations are directly hurting. The problem is really all of our partners and the populations where the impact is really dramatic. And I think there is a crisis, a huge crisis. The problem is that the world doesn't seem to be mobilized to respond to this.
I'll just like to take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Dorothy Nyambi, the President and CEO of MEDA. Apologies for the delay. Dorothy, welcome. You're on mute.
Yes, no, thank you. Sorry, I was late, and technology.
Perfect. You're not the only one having trouble. Dorothy, I will come to you in a second. But Andy, based on what Philippe said, that, there's a small percentage of his budget and Canadian organizations perhaps are not directly impacted, but there is certainly an indirect impact, it seems, to the ecosystem. A damage seems to have been done, despite, however, this might turn out to be, and whichever way that does settle. So do you think there's room for Canadian organizations or the Canadian government to respond in a certain way to these developments?
I do actually. One thing we are seeing a ripple effect happen here, and the key thing is for this ripple effect not to reach Canada. So, as well as what we've said in terms of USAID, and I really want to echo Philippe's word that this is being done in a very cruel way. Many of us have talked about the need to redevelop the global aid system, but to actually cut the head off it right in the middle of it is not a good way to go about doing this. It does give us opportunities to think through how we could see a new order of global aid come up. But right now we're at a car crash doing triage, trying to stop the bleeding. And so in terms of Canadian implications and ways in which Canadians can go forward, Philippe's exactly correct. Many Canadian organizations that are particularly based in Canada still have their pipelines of funding, whether it's through Global Affairs Canada or whether it's through their own donors, foundations, other institutions. But we go through an ecosystem that has been profoundly impacted. So it's the work on the ground. We may be able to, in our case, we may be able to get that pipeline through, but some of the support structures have been taken away. So that's one of the things we're looking at Canadian Food Grains Bank. In the short term, how can we deal with some of those support structures? But in terms of your questions, in terms of ways Canada, what's Canadian role in this? And we're hearing voices raised, as they have been raised in other countries, to say that all aid is corrupt, that it goes to dictators, and this is simply not true. And so the most important thing we can do at the moment, I think, within our sector, but also in the Canadian population, is to help the government of Canada understand, or those that would become the government of Canada, that Canadian aid is compassionate, it's well-leading, it's humane, and we need to keep things flowing. We've just seen just yesterday, we saw the UK government cut aid from 0.5, which had recently been cut from 0.7, and which was really quite a global differed in its day before it was consumed by the Foreign Office. It was a global high standard of how development done. Well, that went from 0.7 to 0.5 a few years ago, and yesterday cut to 0.3. Last week, we saw the Dutch cut their funding as well. So it's absolutely imperative that the Canadian government maintains its lead in doing development in an astute, compassionate and humane way. And that means really funding Canadian CSOs who have great partnerships with people on the ground. It also means really trying to fill in some of the gaps for what's happening here. One of the things we're looking at is asking the Canadian government to unrestrict some of their funding so that we can cover some of the costs outside of the very strict budgetary parameters that we have of some of the implications of what's happening with the cuts of USAID. So there are things we can do in Canada, but the most important thing, and I cannot stress this enough, is to maintain Canadian aid spending as we go forward. We understand the domestic crisis, we understand the calls for more defense, but aid is the thing that joins all the dots of diplomacy and trade and development together. So we really are calling upon the Canadian government to keep that aid flowing.
Perfect. Thank you, Andy. Dr. Dorothy, I would like to come to you, and perhaps I'd like to hear from you more about the role of Canadian organizations, civil society organizations, but also the government in terms of providing leadership in this critical moment, the moment that Andy described and Philippe described of crisis and funding cuts, not just by the US, but by European governments as well. And if this provides room for Canada to take the lead, do more than what it has been doing, what do you think the discussions need to be, and how can leadership be shown?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jeanette, and thanks, Andy and Philippe. Whilst I missed a little bit of the beginning, I've been following through. I think I agree with everything that both of them have said, but I'm going to throw a different wrench into the works here, because I think the fact that, when USAID, we all agree that aid needs some kind of restructuring, relooking at, we all agree, but how it's being done is what we all don't agree about. But I really think that it's a moment for us to say, if one country can disrupt the entire architecture of a sector, then something is wrong with the architecture we have in place. right? And I think for me, that is where Canada has an opportunity to lead. If we look at overall ADA, we're about number 14. USAID is giving almost, 250 billion annually. We're at about 8 billion and so on. So we're going to have some kind of a catalytic effect. Absolutely, we shouldn't reduce the amount, but I think we need to bring that amount into the playing field a little bit differently, right? So, and that's where, I'm coming from MEDA, so I bring a private sector lens. It is, how do we look at these dollars of overseas development assistance, not just as grant funding? We now need to begin to say, as Government of Canada, where do we come in with additional funding, which is capital, repayable capital investments? Let's begin to work with the Global South in a manner that, sure, we need to stop the bleeding now, what is happening, but we must look long term. And that's why I'm asking the Government of Canada to take the lead in the blended finance models, that as we come back out, as we try to look at this, I don't see the job of Canada as filling the gap that USAID did. I see the job of the Government of Canada and we, the people of Canada, as actually beginning to draw a new diagram, a new architecture of what aid should really begin to look like. And, Canada has always been the lead in blended finance. So this for me is the time. I would say, let's keep the ODA at the same level, make it higher, but let's put that money out into the sector a little bit differently.
Perfect, Dr. Dorothy. Thank you. Philippe, I would like to come to you and perhaps get your views on what we heard from Dr. Dorothy, that this is an opportunity not just to do more of the same, but do something that's different and perhaps rethink the architecture. Your views on perhaps how that could be done, and what are some of the ways, what are some of the areas that Canada could look at in terms of reshaping the aid architecture?
Mm-hmm. So I would agree very much that we're not going to be able to fill the gap, and that's not the way to think about it. Also agree that it's a time to think, okay, what are some of the most strategic things we could do to actually do things in a different way for highest impact. The idea of blended finance and really deploying resources in a smart way there makes a lot of sense, and we've been talking that line for a while and little real action. So I think we could see Canada, and we'd like to see Canada move more aggressively in this direction. So I agree with Dorothy in this line. I would also like to suggest that there are some parts of the world where the withdrawal of the US aid system will leave a particularly large gap. And especially when it combines with other geopolitical phenomena that taken together with the USAID things leaves an even bigger gap. So if you take West Africa right now, where the relationship with France was very important for many decades, as you know, and where there is a real separation. I don't know if the word divorce is right, but there is a real distancing between West African governments and people and France, and with the withdrawal of the US as well, you really have now a gap in terms of inflow of ODA into the region. Now, of course, the region needs more than ODA, needs trade, needs to grow from intra-Africa trade, and that's obviously true. But it is also true that ODA has played a key role also in providing resources for infrastructure and for variety of things that have been key for West Africa. So with the gap left by France withdrawal and US now withdrawals, we have a situation where Russia is taking a very important part, or important role in Sahel countries, for example. And I think Canada has to ask itself the question, isn't it the time to, in fact, redouble our engagement in that region of West Africa, generally speaking, where there is actually a good base of relationship and a real strategic play to be made in terms of adding value, being a friend to the region, and maintaining relations with the part of the world that is very important, and going forward will become more and more important. So this is one example. I think a similar case could be made for Haiti, where the country is already in a real disarray, and with the withdrawal of U.S. resources, I think it begs for Canada to play a more proactive role in being a partner to the country in helping it move out of its current long-standing crisis. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. I just like to remind the audience that there's an option to submit questions as well. We can take the last 15 minutes to respond to audience questions. If you would like to use that option on your Zoom to send me questions, I would be happy to read those out towards the end of our discussion. Andy, I'd like to come to you. We heard from Dr. Dorothy and Philippe about some of the ways, Canada could rethink or play a role in the developing context. Would you have, I read something that you wrote about more values-based system.
Yeah.
You spoke about that in some of your opinion pieces. So perhaps you can mention what you mean by those value-based systems and how that they could play a role in the changing dynamics.
Yeah, and it is a very interesting question, because what we're seeing is a shift in development policies across various governments, moving from what I would call a values-based, compassionate, humane system, much more into a transactional basis of what can you do for me if I give you this money. I want to go back to, I'll speak to that, but I want to go back to something that my colleagues here just said. I would fundamentally agree that we need a change in the sector. And I think there is some really interesting things that we can look at around public-private partnerships, things like sustainable development bonds along the lines of what the World Bank has been doing. We have FinDef, our development finance institution, that's going to assume some leadership as part of G7. And so there are many ways in which we can leverage public funds. But I would also say that at this moment, people are dying. I'm just going to put it bluntly. In our sector, we try and find nice ways to say things. But as an organization that really is involved in food security, we're just very aware that people have been cut off from sources of humanitarian supply, where it's just devastating, Jahanzeb. I mean, some of the stories we're hearing are also. So whilst we're looking at a future system, which I hope will be values-based, and we'll come back to that in a moment, we must deal with the bleeding that's going on now. And when you're talking about building new systems, and you're asking, one of the things I'm hearing, for example, is get local governments more involved. We want that. We work with them. We're working with the Ethiopian and Rwandan governments at the moment to build new policies around the way they do agriculture. They don't have the financing to just step in and take over from USAID, and nor does Canada. So as we go forward, first of all, we've got to figure out what we do in this interim. What emergency supports can we bring with our limited aid budget and our limited support from domestic sources, as well as thinking about that new global architecture that Dorothy talked about. So in terms of Canadian values, Canadians have led with their values. Our work has not been, even though there were attempts a decade or so ago to combine trade and development, our work has generally been values-led. And so as we think about going forward, when we start thinking about the influence of other power blocks, shall we say, around the world, I think we do have to combine our work with a realistic understanding of geopolitics, but we must still be very focused on compassionate and humane leadership. That's what Canada is known for. So when I travel around the world and I see Canadian stickers and Canadian flags on things, part of me goes, oh, we shouldn't be advertising this. But another part of me is really happy when local people come up to me and say, well done, Canada. And I do really believe that we have to have a values, compassionate, humane underpinning to why we do global aid. Our job is to do ourselves out of a job because we're trying to see the world develop in humane and ways that build human social capital. So it should not be becoming a transactional basis of what can you do for me that we're seeing happen with other countries. I think that's part of what's going on with USAID. That the aid that will come out of the State Department, now it's assuming control of USAID, will be very much transactional about building America's interests. I really am hoping that isn't the way it goes for Canada, whilst also recognizing Philippe's very well made point that there are other people who will come into the space that's been vacated by USAID that will really have their own agendas. We need to be front and center saying Canada is different. And I think there's an opportunity now to show that Canada is different in the basis of what's happened with USAID and the outright cruelty that's been shown as a result.
Thank you, Andy, for that. Dr. Dorothy, I would like to come to you. You heard Philippe talk about the geopolitical context. You heard Andy talk about the more humane, value-based context. Your view from as MEDA, as a private sector, how would you respond to that, and would you have something to add to the discussion on that front?
Yeah, I think, I mean, whilst I agree with all of that, I just really find myself sometimes in a position to not to fundamentally disagree, but I bring myself to this conversation now as a woman born on the African continent, right? And during this past week, I've seen what Strive Masiwiwa has written. I saw what Uhuru Kenyatta wrote, right? I listened to what, Kagame said, because I find it difficult to be the bearer of the one who say, I know we want to do good, but the people that want to do good, they want to liberate themselves, right? They want to liberate themselves. And I want us to come to the table to meet them where they are, to help them liberate themselves. Right. So I heard what Michelle said about, Philippe said about, Sahel and other people coming. I want to believe that those people on the African continent, they're strong enough and capable of making the right decision for themselves and their people. Right. So I think I struggle a little bit, about totally, I mean, aid is good, but aid is a bridge. The compassion and everything we bring is a bridge, but that's not what got Southeast Asia to where it is. That's not what has moved people from being from the last bottom to being the BRICS countries, right? Aid is a bridge. And if we see it as a bridge, that there's a starting point, there's a stopping point, let's build the systems that allow us to get to graduate from that bridge. So these countries and these people, can take their responsibility. They don't become so fragile. Right now, the level of fragility, people are dying because there are no systems in the places, Andy. And so they're so fragile. Every whim of today is US, tomorrow is Canada, France has done its own. So every whim of everything affects these people in a manner that is just untold of, right? So there comes a point where I really, truly believe that, the person sitting in Rwanda, are they looking for aid? They want to build a system. They want to build their country. They want you to come and give them a loan. They will use it appropriately, do the work that they need to do for their people, pay you back. That's dignity. That's ownership for those people, right? So my cry is that, as Canada, let us be able to work with these people in a manner that they will feel dignified by what's coming to them. It is like working with them and not working for them. We don't need to do anything for anybody. We need to do it with them. So I just have a totally different opinion.
Can I just comment on that? So,
Of course,
Dorothy, Dorothy, I'm not disagreeing with you there. I think what I'm saying is that is phase two. We have talked about this for years. Even you and I have had conversations, and we absolutely are in agreement that we must, like I say, we want to do ourselves out of a job. This is about building dignity and human capital in places like Rwanda, where I know very well and lived for some time, and other places, 100%. I think the conversation that I'm also interested in having today is we just locked off a huge amount of the current infrastructure. And so we are going to have to triage before we can get there. So in all understanding and agreement with you, today I have to figure out, and other leaders in the sector have to figure out, who are we going to try and support in the midst of a massive hunger crisis in places like South Sudan, where I'm heading next week, when this aid has just been shut down, when a large part of the ecostructure has just been gone. So 100% in agreement with you. But right now, I'm also trying to figure out, as are many people across the sector, what do we do on Monday with 50 billion being chopped out of this, with kitchens being closed, with schools being closed, with PEPFAR being closed down? What do we do on Tuesday with people banging on the doors of our food distribution centers around the world, trying to find food? So your point is 100% made. I wouldn't say that we have a difference. We have an emergency crisis, and then we need to very much transition as fast as possible into a new system. And let's be honest, the old system wasn't working very well. You're completely correct. And to try and resurrect that system is going to be impossible anyway. So this gives us the opportunity to have that conversation. But first of all, we have first aid we have to do. But I'm 100% in with you on the need to more than have that conversation. We have an opportunity here. But right now, we also know that people are starving, people are sick. people are without education as a result, and organizations are going under. So we have to deal with an emergency crisis before we can get to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And my background is in medicine. I totally believe. But if we don't build a system, yesterday it was Ebola, tomorrow is a flood, it's a drought, today is USAID. I think for me is we keep seeing the same thing with just in a cycle. I don't think I'm surprised if what is happening now. What I'm surprised about is that we continue to come across of us, including me, unprepared. That's the question I'm asking myself. That what would I have been doing differently 5 years ago to prepare for this, right? And I want to start to do that today so that 5 years down, we're better prepared for this same emergency or a different kind of emergency.
Philippe, would you like to come to that? It feels like you have something to say.
Yeah, well, I'd like to come back to the question of, is aid value-based? Is it national interest-based? Is it both? And clearly you have politicians who look at it from one side or the other. And people, of course, the reason why I'm in this business, and the same I'm sure is for Andy and Dorothy, is because we care about doing something useful for others, which is similar motivation that motivates plenty of professions where you basically do things out of desire to feel useful and do something worthwhile in life. But it doesn't mean that that's the only reason why funding is there. And my impression, I think, if you read at the reasons why many of the aid institutions were created, it was done both for values as well as national interests. If you take the case of Korea, and that comes actually to the point of Dorothy and whether aid is good or whether it's the typical donor who imposes. I mean, for development to be successful, you need national leadership like what you have in Rwanda or in Kenya or in Ghana, or what we had in Korea, in many countries where you have strategic leadership and capacity to execute and good governance over decades, and things go well. And when you have that, aid can be useful. Otherwise, it's often fighting against the wind. So if you take the case of Korea, which went through a situation after the war of real deprivation to an amazing success story. I mean, the Korean leaders were the ones who made it succeed. And they also credit the aid that they received as having, provided a critical resource and skills gap at a critical time. And that was effective in the same way that, Rwanda and Ghana have benefited from resources, but it doesn't mean that it's the aid that made them succeed. What made them succeed really is their leadership and their resources. But then why do Canada provide support to any country, and let's say Korea? I mean, yes, it was for values, but it also provided Canada with, a much bigger global market. You look at exports of Canada to Africa, I don't know if you realize since 2000, they have tripled. They moved from 1.2 billion to now $4 billion dollars of exports per year. And with the demographics of Africa and the growth of Africa, Africa is going to become a very important market for the world and for Canada, no doubt. So we do have an interest in Africa succeeding. Also, with the demographic bulge of Africa, where we're going to have 1 billion new people between 2025 and 2050, if this 1 billion people are educated, get opportunities to employ themselves productively, it's going to be very good for their well-being. It's going to be very good for stability of Africa. It's going to be very good for stability in the world. And that's also in our interest, both from a market and from a stability and security point of view. So I think it's not wrong to say that we also have a self-interest, and to acknowledge that as a reason why we want, all parts of the world to do well. If big parts of the world don't do well, it's going to mean major crisis for the world, obviously. So I don't see anything really wrong in admitting that we do this for values and for national interests. And by having both, we actually can get more of a support with the Canadian people, and to mobilize more resources to do things in the right way, as Dorothy was saying.
Dorothy, any response to what Philippe is saying, that perhaps the two can be combined?
No, I think it's both sides, right? I'm really glad, Philippe talking about, what's in it for Canada. And so, what's in it for all those 54 African countries as well, right? So whilst we're trading there, those 54 countries in Africa have to be trading with the rest of the world. And so, Africa has got to move from being recipient of everything, technology, recipient of products, finished goods and everything. So what is it that Africa and those 54 countries on that continent are going to produce so that the rest of the world can consume? So, and I think it's only when we get to that stable state, right? And we will get there, absolutely, that, that population bulge is going to be effective. But if it's a population bulge that is just going to be recipient of technology, recipient of everything to come to it, I think it will still not create a fair and, a competitive world for everybody. But really, like the fact that Philippe said, there is an interest, for us as a people in Canada, why, other parts of the world need to be up and developed, so that we can trade, we can, have different kinds of levels of exchange, beyond just recipients of aid. So fully agree.
Andy, I wanted to come to you because you mentioned about value-based approach. Philippe has mentioned interest matters as well. Do you think if you approach it from a value-based perspective, you can also convince people who seek more interest out of it to convince them that the two perhaps are not contradictory?
Well, I would completely agree with Philippe and also Dorothy's comments. You can have a values-based international development system, a Canadian international development system, and still really integrate with your trade diplomacy and even your defense talks. I mean, I was listening to the Liberal leadership debate the other night, and everybody right across the spectrum was saying we need to increase our defense. That's perfectly understandable at the current time. I think that values-based development is the thing that joins all those things together. My concern would be that if we went down fully the interest, the national interest road, there would be places in the world where we should be working on a values base that would have no quid pro quo for Canada. It could be because of the trade, or they don't have the minerals we want, or whatever it might be. And so I think you have to have a balanced approach in terms of trade, the 3 Ds and T, defense, development, diplomacy, and trade, that also allows you to say, and this area really doesn't have much impact on us as a country, but is an area where we need to be because it's Canadian values. So I think that's really important. One other thing I'd like to bring into this conversation, I noticed someone, I think Dave Blondell on the Q&A mentioned this, and it's something we feel very important at Canadians Food Grains Bank, and I think, I know Dorothy looks at as well, I'm sure Philippe does, and that's the whole process of localization. Localization has been a very buzzword, if you like, in our sector for some time, but we found it hard as a sector to really say, well, how do we give away power? Because we still work in a sort of post-colonial aid system. I think we have a real opportunity here as we get into that phase 2 to really ensure that the power rests with our partners on the ground and that they're making the key decisions rather than us. Because money talks and we know what walks, and suddenly having a lot of that money taken out of the system really gives us an opportunity to go further in the whole sense of listening to our partners and saying, what do you require? What do you need? Listening to countries, listening to government. So I think there is a real opportunity as we go down this route for both those things, Jahanzeb, a values-based approach that integrates with a wider foreign policy agenda of Canada, but also something that integrates with the absolute agency that people should have on the ground to actually talk about how aid is spent, how projects are developed, monitored, evaluation, and how we judge results. Like I say, we need to do ourselves out of a job, and that starts with listening to local people.
Dorothy, thank you, Andy. Thank you also for Andy for responding to Dave's question. Dorothy, I wanted to come to you. I think you mentioned blended finance, and there's a question by Diana.
It's a question. Yeah, I saw
Diana asking if blended finance is the best solution for the context that you work in. Would you like to respond to that?
Yes, no, Diana, thanks for the question. the way we are with international development, I'll say, if we continue doing the same thing, we've been doing it since 1945. We've seen different results in different parts of the world. We've seen parts of the world where, due to blended finance, investment, and different approaches, things have come out differently. So I'll say for us, it is, give us the opportunity. I think Andy mentioned, Canada has the Financial Development Institution, FinDev. We have FinDev. We have organizations like MEDA that we do blended finance work. We have Desjardins, just to name a few, right, that are involved in this kind of work. And for me, Diane, it is really about, we need to try and do something different and look at those solutions that allow people to just have the dignity for themselves. I want to go back to value-based. One of the greatest values in life is respect. And respect is not a word. Respect is not what you say. I cannot tell you that I respect you. What I do needs you to feel respected, right? Respect is a very complex value. It's a value that we use a lot. And I think for me, when I talk about blended finance, I'm beginning to say, how do we even show up on the table, respecting what it is that we're going to do, so people feel respected by how we've showed up, right? So I think blended finance is for it. Let's give it a chance. I'll be happy to have a conversation with you, Diane, offline, but to say, if we continue to do what we've done since 1945 and expect different results, we all know what that quotation means and what it says. So we need to do something different. And we've seen it work in other parts of the world.
Perfect. Thank you, Dorothy, and thank you for responding to the questions. Philippe, I wanted to come to you. I think there's a question from Dwayne Hodgson asking, what arguments should the sector make to the next Canadian government, regardless of which party wins? They should not follow the American example and slash bilateral and multilateral aid. You talked about, foreign policy and interests, Philippe. So perhaps, do you think you could take this question and respond to what could be the arguments that the Canadian civil societies make to the government?
Yes, well, I think it's really what we've been talking for this whole conversation, and it starts with Andy's point and strong points about a value-based approach, and maybe defining that in a way that integrates both our goal to do good and to be good global citizen, at the same time to do things that fit with strategic interests, whether it be geopolitical, diplomacy or trade. And I think we need to make that case in a convincing way of how it makes Canada better off by being generous, yes, and by helping other countries in a smart way, in a way that's respectful and that's effective, do well so that they do well. And as a result, we also do very well through trade and through security and stability. There is the topic of migration, which is delicate, and I think we will all hesitate how to link this to this topic. It's a little bit uncomfortable because for many people, okay, you're gonna do aid to slow down migration. It sounds like you're anti-migration. So you see a lot of folks in our sector being uncomfortable with this topic, which is very understandable. But at the same time, I feel that we have to get to that topic because it's politically extremely omnipresent. And understanding the links between development and migration is important. And the place of aid in connection to development and migration is very important as well. And I think we can here make the point that if you look at migrations, let's say take Africa again, you have much more migration within the continent than between the continent and other parts of the world. So cities of countries that are doing well, like Accra or Abidjan or Lagos, are absorbing very large number of migrants from parts of the continent where people are struggling because of conflict or because of other reasons. And then some of that population moves to, let's say, Europe or to America. When you have major crisis of conflict and displacement, and migration flows become disorganized, it's a lot of suffering for the people who have to experience that. The people who migrate from through the caravans of Central America, the statistics show that 1 woman out of 2 is victim of violence, sexual violence. So it's not something that people want to experience. finding ways to create opportunities that will prevent people from having to experience that suffering is positive for them. And it also potentially makes it easier to manage international migration flows in a way that's more orderly and less creates less pressures. When you had a mass flow of Syrian refugees into Europe, it created social tensions that were difficult because it was very sudden. It was a very large number of people very suddenly. So it's clearly in the interest of Canada as well and other parts of the world that migration flows be managed differently. And I think development assistance can be part of that sphere. But I think we need to find the right way to link the two. I'm not suggesting I necessarily have the right pitch just now, but I think it's very important because the topic is too big to be ignored.
Perfectly. That's a wonderful answer. Thank you very much. There's another question from Jet asking if any of the panelists have heard officially or unofficially from the Government of Canada as to what their approach might be or what their initial thoughts are. I was wondering if there's anyone from the panelists who would be able to comment on that.
I can't speak for the other two. I mean, we are in pretty constant contact with Global Affairs Canada. We have an institutional funding grant around humanitarian work that's a multi-year grant and some other grants as well. And I think what I would say, just in terms of the tone, without going into great detail, is I think there is some concern. I think that it's been shared with a number of us that aid is going to need to be very transparent and accountable and be able to prove its worth, basically. And I think that's a realistic thing. I think we should be able to do that. And I think there are places where we fail quite badly in that. But I think we're in the context of an upcoming election. It could be any time, really, once the Liberal leadership election has taken place. Some people are saying we could be into an immediate election. We're certainly going to be into one by October. That's the law. And the two parties have quite different position on AIDS. And so Global Affairs Canada is very aware of that, I think, and are preparing getting their ducks in a row for whoever's going to be in that seat in months to come. And I think that really goes to some of the things we've been hearing some voices say around aid is corrupt, it goes to dictators. And then when you kind of drill down on that, they say, oh, not you, we mean this. When those voices come and raise those things, we're all tarred with that brush. And I think we need to be able to prove our worth. And I think this is where I agree with Dorothy. As we look at a transition in a system, and as we look at a different system, we're going to need to do that even more so. But right now, we still need to do it. So I think I would say there's a sense of let's wait and see, but also a sense of concern at Global Affairs Canada that they're watching what happened down with USAID and wondering. I think where I'm at is don't try this at home, kids, basically.
Perfect, Andy. Thank you very much. Dorothy, wanted to come to you. There's another question by Mary Bridger asking what role should debt forgiveness play in aid and development? You talked about rethinking the model, not doing the same thing since 1945. Does debt, not forgiving debt, and perhaps talking more about wealth redistribution as another point Mary has raised. Would you have comments on looking at those modalities as well?
Yeah, no, I think, debt forgiveness plays a big thing. The policies that govern global trade, WTO, plays a big thing, right? If I'm a farmer farming corn in the north of Mali, then drought comes, I then get a big wash of food donations that come from the people of the United States in big bags and everything. So there's all kinds of trade things. Those farmers don't have the kinds of protections that the farmers in North America have, right? So with that, I think debt forgiveness, but it has to be done in an environment where the governance, where the political will is there. I think it was Philippe who gave some examples of those countries where that political will is there so that the money doesn't fall into corrupt hands and so on. And that transparency, so people know and everything. So I think there is a space and the room for debt forgiveness to help people pull up their boots, and get a little bit further. But I think the trade architecture and how goods get moved and everything. So, whilst people are hungry, it's not because they couldn't play. If they did agriculture, which was not irrigated, and drought has come, why then should we take the food from, Kansas in the United States to send it over to them, right? So those are the things that, we just struggle with. I just want to touch on one last point, that whoever comes into government in Canada, as a sector, what we really need to do, Andy said it, was we need to show the return on the investment. Is accountability. We need to show the people of Canada, because government of Canada is all Canadians from coast to coast, right? That's who, it's a taxpayer, it's our tax money. And I want it to go into good use. It's my tax money, it's everybody's tax money. And so we owe it to the Canadian people to show them what is the good results, the return on investment. Because I think with that, it doesn't matter who is sitting there politically, we then become a good ally, a good accomplice to any government, to help to move that agenda in, as Andy said, in the values base, absolutely. I want to conclude by saying that Canadian values are really top, and we should not lose that, wherever we sit and wherever we go.
Thank you, Dorothy, for that response. Philippe, I wanted to come to you. I know we started a bit late, so we might extend the conversation about 5-10 minutes. But Philippe, I wanted to come to you. There is a question. If this moment can be a pivot for the how of the system, as per Dorothy's points, is there an advocacy opportunity for Canada at the G7 to start that conversation among the audience? And then with the G20, Philippe, you mentioned about, national interests, foreign policy at a G7 level, at a more international, bigger level. What do you think the discussions could be, and what Canada's role could be?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. If you look at the last 25 years, around 2000, there was, if you remember that, the Paris Declaration around the principle that development had to be country-driven, and partners were to support the country in a coordinated way, pool resources, and let the country drive its own path, right? So very much along the lines of what Dorothy was saying. You want country leaders to actually decide how they're going to drive things, and instead of receiving aid with strings attached, it's in a framework that they control, and everything is coordinated by them and done in a coordinated way. There was a lot of momentum with this in the first decades between 2000 and 2010. And then it slowly eroded, where we went back to people wanting to do their own thing, a lot of flag planting, and move more to national interest in a sharper way. And now we're moving to the extreme of that. So we've sort of done a departure from let's do the right thing for countries to develop well by doing things in a coordinated way, so that you really develop national systems in a structured way with country leadership, to let's only do things that are in national interest, and to each his own. So we're going to have a much reduced value of the development spending as a result of that. So I feel that bringing back this topic on the table at the G20, at the G7 and G20 would be very good. Now, is there going to be political will by the G7 or G20 to play that game again? I don't know. I'm a little bit skeptical. I think we are in an era of very much self-interest based transactional relations. I mean, it's going to be driven that way by the US, and I think it's going to contaminate the rest of the world for a good period. And it may take a while before we move back to a more balanced view. So, but I think Canada should take a long view to this, take a balanced view, and move, try to advocate for such an approach over time.
Thank you, Philippe. We'll move into concluding. So perhaps I could give each of the panelists the last word to give the concluding thoughts. Andy, since we started with you, I'd like to come with you, and perhaps a concluding remarks on what we discussed today, and what you think you would like to say before we end.
Sure, fascinating discussion. I always really enjoy listening to these two colleagues and the perspectives they bring. And today has been very enlightening for all of us, I think. I think the key things I would say as we go forward are, and it really comes off the back of something Philippe just said, we have the grand bargain that was brought together in 2016 around humanitarian action, about putting more means and more resources into the hands of people on the ground so that they would be able to decide for themselves. I think we have opportunities to do that. I think we have opportunities to see more localization happen. I think we have more opportunities to see interesting financial instruments that could really change the shape of the way aid happens. But I also want to say, quite bluntly, half the global aid ecostructure was just ripped out. And next week I go to South Sudan. I'll be right up on the border of Sudan, and there are hundreds of thousands of people there who are now without food and assistance that they had last week. That is of deep, deep, deep concern. So right now, my feeling would be we need to advocate very strongly with the Canadian government. I would talk about anybody listening, contacting their MPs, motivating others to contact MPs as well, to say, let's not go the way that USAID went. Let's not go the way that UK aid development spending went yesterday. Let's not go the way that the Dutch development spending went about 12 days ago. Let's keep Canadians at the forefront. There's a paucity of leadership in the world at the moment. You know, a few years ago, we would talk about Angela Merkel, or we might talk about Jacinda Ardern in terms of values-based leadership. Who's leading the world at the moment? I would hate to think it's Donald Trump. So I think there's an opportunity for Canadians to step up. I think there's an opportunity for our government to step up. I think there's an opportunity for a new aid eco-structure to come into place. But right now, we have to solve the immediate problem of people suffering and dying around the world because they suddenly lost their support, of organizations being ripped apart because they're owed millions of dollars that we've just been told this morning is not going to be paid. We have to deal with the car crash, and then we have to go forward. And I hope Canada is right at the forefront of that.
Thank you very much, Andy, for those wonderful thoughts. Dr. Dorothy, concluding words?
No, not much more different to add from what I think, and Andy has said. I think for me is certainly, 250 billion has certainly, has halted in many ways, and that's a big effect. So I think there is a need for us to look at the immediate, but I don't want for us to lose sight of what we need to start doing today for long term. So whilst Andy is, he's heading to South Sudan, I am looking at, he's looking at the immediate. All of us cannot look at the immediate. Some of us need to start to look at the long term, the systems and things that need to be put in place that will actually make sure that when other shocks happen, we don't feel the effect this way. And for me, what that really means is that the Canadian government, we don't have much. Our money is catalytic in the pool of ODA, right? We bring our goodwill, our good spirit, our good values. We cannot put money to that. It's a big thing that we bring to the table. So let's continue to bring that. In terms of resources, 266 billion from the US, 8 billion from Canada. In terms of ODA, it's little. So how do we make that have the biggest fill? And so I think we need to really look as Canadian organizations and as the government of Canada, where do we build the right partnerships so that this money can go as far as it can to do the most that it can do for those who deserve it and who want to actually absolutely work themselves out of poverty. Again, I say that the solution of poverty is prosperity. Prosperity is a really big word, but it comes with people. The population has to be educated. The governance needs to be there for the economic. So there's a whole bundle of things, gamut of things that leads to prosperity. So again, for me, mine is, let's use this as an opportunity to actually begin to fix the system whilst taking care of the bleeding.
Dr. Dorothy, thank you very much for that. Philippe, I would like to come to you to conclude this.
Yes, thank you. Well, I would say that I think Canadians are looking at what's happening and are a little bit baffled, right? I think we all are, and I think everyone is, right? You're watching what's happening in the US and you're wondering, okay, what's happening? At some level, I think many Canadians sympathize with the idea that, okay, well, it'd be nice if we could cut taxes. It'd be nice if we could have a more efficient public service. It'd be nice if there could be less waste. So at some level, that's why there is support for these ideas, and it's very understandable. But when you see that to reduce our taxes, we're doing it by cutting support to the most vulnerable people in the world. And you do that because that's what's politically easiest to do for yourself. That's something I think many Canadians feel a little bit uneasy with. And I think there is a lot of people here watching this with distaste. And we need to capitalize on that, to sort of take that story further, it's 1% of our public expenditure. So if you want to reduce public expenditure significantly on your tax burden, it's not going to be by focusing on this 1% and making it slightly less. I mean, it's actually a very, very small part of your total budget. And you're focusing there because it's not directly hurting your own population, but it's actually a small amount. So it's sort of politically expedient, Second, you have to think that by doing that, you may forego a significant national interest too, as we discussed before. So I think this whole question of discussion with Canadians is important. The problem is that we, from the sector, are not well placed to have it because we sound interested, and we do not have, the legitimacy. So I think we need to be smart in seeing what's the right way to have the conversation and the communication. And I'm not sure what the answer to that, but I think that's where we really need to struggle and find a way to engage Canadians with thinkers who are not interested and who will see, the wise way forward, and influence Canadians to influence their politicians to do the right thing.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Philippe. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Dr. Dorothy. Thank you, Philippe. And thank you to your audience for being patient with us through the technical difficulties at the beginning. We apologize for that. But I think the discussion went rather well once I managed to join the conversation. But thank you very much again. Thank you, Andy, Dr. Dorothy, Philippe, and our audience. And a recording of this would be available. And we will be happy to share that with you. And at Future Good, we would like to continue the discussion on this topic and many others in the future. And we'd like to ask you to keep following our journalism and be a part of this discussion later on. Thank you, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Ciao, Andy.
Ciao, Philippe.